The sixth generation of consoles was a time of experimentation and the cementing of many tropes that then future video game designers would come to adopt as standards for tailoring gameplay experiences. Though many of these things were present in previous generations, they were not nearly as prevalent as they had been in the sixth generation. Something as simple as, say, the standard dual analog controller first solidified its footing in this era. But there was something else that truly blossomed during this time of experimentation and the laying of groundwork for modern gaming: the auteur developer. These are the lead directors of video games who have their own unique way of developing experiences for the player that transcend the conventions of the time, and set a new standard for narrative or gameplay mechanics. Though creating a video game requires a team of designers, programmers, and artists, these auteurs manage to leave their mark on the game by being the face of the studio and micromanaging every aspect of the project, giving it their own unique sense of handcrafted magic that no other studio can muster, even ones that manage to recapture the essence of many of these games. Such examples of auteurs from the 5th and 6th generations of gaming include John Romero of Doom fame, Suda51 with his game Killer 7, Hideo Kojima, whose late-night LSD and spy drama binges brought us Metal Gear Solid, and Fumito Ueda, the creator of ICO and Shadow of the Colossus, the former of which is the game we're going to be taking a look at today. ICO puts you in the gaudy outfit of our titular protagonist, the young boy, ICO. In the beginning, he's being escorted to a vault where he will eventually be sacrificed to appease the gods by these very adult men, one of which has this incredibly Chad sword emblazoned with runes for some reason. There's really nothing in the castle they're about to enter that would require the use of anything more dangerous than a particularly large stick, at least until ICO goes off on his little adventure. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe they had an incident where they had to impale an especially aggressive 12-year-old with a magical blade because he was about to get away. I don't know, they're the experts when it comes to child sacrifice, not me. Eventually, ICO is locked in a room with an alarming number of vaults. The villagers who escorted our protagonist apologize and tell him that sacrificing him is what's good for the village, in their own made-up language, not unlike the one the band Igor, that's Igor with 3 R's, uses for their lyrics. This is because they hold a superstition in which they believe a child born with horns is a bad omen for the village, and he must be sacrificed at the age of 12 as to not incur the wrath of the gods. I don't know if a child born with horns is actually a bad omen for his village, but it's certainly a bad omen for his mother, because those pointy horns probably tore through her cervix like I tear through noobs in Halo Combat Evolved. Unfortunately, the expertise of these men in the sacred art of child sacrifice is brought into question when ICO's vault falls off its shelf and he's suddenly able to break free from his shackles. This is when we're introduced to the gameplay. The movement is simple. Just push the left analog stick in the direction that you want to go relative to the fixed camera angle, and you'll be on your merry way. Things get a little more complicated when you add pressing triangle in order to jump to the mix, but that's nothing a pro gamer such as myself couldn't handle. I am ashamed to admit, however, that I didn't know you could do certain things in this game, such as swinging on chains without the aid of the internet. This is due in part to my own stupidity in not reading the manual like a good boy, but also thanks to its minimalist user interface. You see, there's no tutorial or helpful hints that pop up on the screen. There's actually nothing on the screen at all, aside from button prompts, outside of the game world itself. It's just you and the game. This is good because it helps with immersion and fosters the lonely atmosphere that this game is trying to convey, and bad because there are plenty of moments where you'll have no idea what the hell you're supposed to do next. I personally think the good outweighs the bad. Luckily, the levels are designed fairly well and you won't be lost for too long if you search hard enough. Plus, the game is very easy and forgiving. The only frustrations I had were when I accidentally fell to my death, and the last time I saved was about 20 minutes before that because the checkpoint system is very fickle. The only difficulties you'll have are part and parcel of playing a PlayStation 2 game. You know, imprecise and awkward platforming, and camera angles that will make you want to commit Sudoku. Of course, though you can pan the camera and see the information you need, the frame rate on the PlayStation 2 version, combined with the hazy, dreamlike art style, makes the entire thing damn near invisible when the camera's moving, and you have to stabilize the camera for a few seconds so you can see what you need to see. Luckily, the graphics are very good for a game made in 2001, and the art style looks very nice despite being shades of brown with the occasional green pasture. One last note, you'll probably see some visual artifacts on the side of the screen during the duration of this video. That's not the game's fault. It's a byproduct of running the emulator using hardware rendering. When I started playing, I immediately knew what to do because points of interest are highlighted in such a way that interacting with them almost immediately brought me to my next objective, which was the girl in the cage, Yorda. She's introduced in an extremely trippy sequence that makes you question the reality in which the game is set. But things quickly become a whole lot more concrete when you're tasked with picking up a large stick and bonking a shadow creature over the head while he's trying to kidnap her. I failed at this more times than I'd like to admit because I wasn't aware you could pull her out of the pool of darkness at this point in the game. This is when the game-long escort mission commences. Before you start rolling your eyes, this is not your ordinary escort mission. Yorda is basically the only thing separating you from crushing loneliness. Even then, you still feel kind of alone because you don't speak the same language as her. At first, I thought her subtitles were just the emulator bugging out on me, but she actually speaks in an incomprehensible runic language that ICO does not speak. Therefore, ICO can only communicate with her using basic noises and gestures. This is an extremely brilliant method of communicating to the player that you don't necessarily need to use words in order to form a bond with someone. Even a child can do it. After you retrieve Yorda, the game opens up and you're tasked with getting out of this very beige castle that was clearly designed by fans of the 1996 first-person shooter Quake. Yorda is fairly easy to escort. She doesn't have the self-preservation of a depressed lemming like many escort targets do, and she stands still and moves exactly when you tell her to. Sometimes her pathfinding can be a bit wonky and her AI slow, but here's the thing. If you're getting tired of her bullshit, you can just yank her by the arm and drag her from one room to the next. The way they made Yorda feel less like a janky burden and more like someone you need to protect at all costs is nothing short of brilliant design. Something as mundane as going one room over without her is anxiety-inducing, because you're constantly paranoid since something can go horribly wrong at a moment's notice. This feeling is perpetuated to an extent by the combat. The combat in this game is intended to fill several roles within the overarching atmosphere, the first being the need to create tension, which is something that would be severely lacking if there wasn't the ever-present threat of monsters coming in and taking Yorda to their shadowy little funhouse. The second would be to break up the monotony of solving puzzles and exploring the ruined fort. That's all well and good, but how well does it succeed in doing these things? I have to admit, the combat doesn't do a very good job at creating tension past a certain point in the game or spicing up the core gameplay loop. Look, I know ICO is a kid and he's not trained in the art of swordplay, so all he can do is vigorously bash at opponents with a stick for what seems like an eternity. But the combat is not difficult, nor is it interesting. It might seem difficult at first, but if you know even the most basic fundamentals of crowd control, you should have zero problems with the combat system. My main issue with it is that it's boring. It's not challenging. You never feel like you or Yorda are in danger, especially since the shadow monsters can't kill you. And before you get the sword, it takes like 30 seconds just to kill a single monster. I was never afraid that I was going to lose when I started a fight. I just felt frustrated that I was going to have to press square for several minutes before the game let me play it again. Also, get this. I found out towards the end that you can just run out of the room and the monsters would despawn. Finding out that little tidbit of information so late in the game tickled my taint even more than it should have. Since most of the game is exploring the castle and trying to open the main gate that Yorda's shadowy mother sealed away, I'm going to fast forward to the ending scenes of the game because these are what really tied the whole experience together. After ICO and Yorda escape the main gate, they have to cross a very long bridge. Suspiciously long. I say this because the thing collapses when they reach the halfway point, as absurdly long bridges in video games are prone to do. Unfortunately for ICO, but very fortunately for Yorda's mother, Yorda is consumed by a shadowy, shadow, and is taken back to the fortress for ritualistic purposes. ICO falls off the bridge, seemingly to his death. He's not dead, of course, because the ending would kind of suck if that were the case. Luckily, he caught this chain just in time and his platform— oh, no, it looks like he's dead now. Just kidding, we have a great power at our disposal, the ability to respawn. The devs decided to mix things up a bit and take us out of the dull brown castle and throw us into an even darker and drearier section at the bottom of the fortress. This is the final stretch of the game. There's something lonely, yet oddly serene about traversing these damp depths by yourself. The soundtrack, or really the lack thereof, really shines through the most in this area. The game's lack of a soundtrack was possibly one of the best design decisions these guys made. I believe it made me understand what it was trying to communicate to me much more effectively, and when actual music did show up, it felt much more poignant. After this long and pensive platforming section, ICO reaches this game's equivalent of the Master Sword, the same sword that one of the villagers held in the beginning of the game. For some reason, it's just lying around here. This is the best weapon in the game, at least on the first playthrough, since it can steamroll anything that is unfortunate enough to stand in your way. Now it's time to rescue Yorda from the clutches of her evil mother. Immediately I walk into the ritual site and encounter these shadow creatures ganging up around her and presumably siphoning her life force away from her. It was at this moment that I ran in, expecting an epic battle, but something else happened. Instead, I was taken on an emotional roller coaster ride, the likes of which I had never felt in any game. As I start to cut through the shadowy horde, I realize that this fight feels very drawn out. At first I thought this was just bad game design, but then I noticed something. We're in the same vaults that ICO dropped into in the beginning of the game. Not only that, every time I kill one of these mysterious creatures, one of the vaults lights up. Suddenly, the fact that these creatures have horns on the tops of their heads makes sense. These are the spirits of the horned children who have been sacrificed to appease ICO's village's superstitious prejudices. This 10-minute section of the game managed to give you a feeling of empowerment from getting a sword, then foster a righteous fury once you start to destroy the shadow creatures with this incredibly powerful blade. Then instantly make you feel melancholy and a twinge of guilt when you realize that you're cutting down the spirits of innocent children who are afraid. They don't fight back either. It makes cutting through the next spirit even more painful than the last. ICO made me feel more in 10 minutes than many other games made me feel in 15 hours. But this isn't the end. Once all of the creatures are banished to their vaults, it's time to leave Yorda behind for now and defeat her mother once and for all. My righteous fury had returned to me at that point, but I couldn't help feel that it was somewhat misplaced, because she wasn't necessarily responsible for the deaths of around 100 innocent children. She is, however, responsible for the imprisonment and weakening of Yorda. It turns out her entire plan was to siphon her daughter's life energy so she can restore her youth and not wither away. I mean, this shouldn't come as a surprise, considering the manual said as much, but I said earlier that I didn't read the manual, so I guess you didn't hear that from me. In a sense, she's not unlike the villagers who sacrificed those children, though. They were both willing to compromise the well-being of their own future generations in order to retain a short-sighted sense of fulfillment. Yorda's mother was willing to sacrifice her daughter for her own youth, and ICO's village was willing to sacrifice hundreds of their own children for a false perception of prosperity. This and loneliness are the most recurring themes in this game's narrative. Yorda's mother as a boss fight isn't too difficult. Just smack her bubble shield with a sword, run behind the stonework, and wait until she spurts out power to grab the sword and smack her again. After ICO defeats her, he plunges a sword through her dark, shriveled heart, but not before she tells him Yorda will never leave the castle. I don't see how that would convince ICO to spare her life, because she has zero redeeming qualities, and doesn't really have much to offer ICO. After that incident, ICO is knocked back and his other horn is broken off. Since he lost a ton of blood from losing an appendage, he loses consciousness as the castle is crumbling around him. Luckily, Yorda is alive and she gets infused with the power of the shadow, which means she can lift ICO up like he's a sleeping toddler and bring him back to the canoe, sending him on a slow boat to whatever coastline he happens to wash up on. The castle finally comes down around Yorda's shadowy visage, presumably trapping her inside forever. The credits roll and the post-credits scenes that show our time together play. Even though I know for a fact I thought she was a pain in the ass for most of the game, I couldn't help but feel a surge of emptiness after seeing the times I had together with this fictional character. The beautiful folk piece playing in the background did not help either. After the credits end, ICO ends up on the shore and takes a long walk along the beach until he comes across a few pixels that look out of place. Turns out those pixels are Yorda, who washed up on the beach. When I found her, I breathed a sigh of relief that this set of animated polygons was still alive, and ICO and Yorda presumably ride off into the sunset happily ever after. To wrap things up, this game definitely deserves its status as an esteemed, influential classic. Though it did feel about as cumbersome as most other PS2 games, and is most certainly a product of its time regarding the overall feel of the gameplay, there's just a lot that can be said about the way it communicates its narrative in a minimalistic way. This holistic application of the show-don't-tell school of environmental storytelling and lonely atmosphere would later go on to influence games such as Dark Souls and even more fast-paced action games like Dusk. ICO is an all-time great that shows you don't necessarily need to have impeccable gameplay in order to be considered an influential classic. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Creamy out. See you in a few weeks.